Good evening, friends. A very warm welcome to all of you to this Golden Jubilee lecture. In fact, we've had three in a row. We had on the 5th we had Nilofer Gole, on the 6th we had Jose Casanova, and today we have Craig Calhoun. I'm really delighted to welcome Craig to the center and to deliver this Golden Jubilee lecture. Professor Calhoun, as most of you might know, is the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Before he took this assignment in September 2012, he was university professor at the NYU, the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge, and also president of the Social Science Research Council. More importantly, however, Craig is one of the world's leading social scientists whose work connects sociology to culture. It's completely interdisciplinary. It connects sociology to culture, to communication, politics, economics, and also philosophy. He's profoundly self-reflexive about his own work as well as about the multiple disciplines in which he's placed, as is evident from a series of books that he's written or edited in social theory. Indeed, one of his books is called Critical Social Theory. He is the editor of over a dozen books, which include, as I mentioned, lots of books in social theory, including critical perspectives on the work of Habermas and Bourdieu and Charles Taylor's Secular Age. He is also, however, the author of more than half a dozen monographs. I can mention just a few of them. One of them is a book called Nations Matter, in which Craig has argued that a purely post-national politics is both premature and possibly politically dangerous. He believes that since nationalism cannot be wished away, it must be transformed. So it must be freed from the prison house of fixed and inherited identities and linked instead with imaginatively wrought public projects that continually redefine and remake the terms of national integration. This is a book that he wrote against the dominant current at the time, which was critiquing nationalism, both substantively and also broadly. Another book of his, Neither Gods Nor Emperors, Students and the Struggle for Democracy in China, is in part a detailed ethnography of the movement in and around Tiananmen Square in 1989. Craig was present there all through the movement. He was there in Beijing. And in part is a careful and systematic and sophisticated analysis of its context, its objectives, its leadership, its eventual suppression, and also its continual legacy. In one of his more recent books, a book which came out in 2012, The Roots of Radicalism, Tradition, Public Sphere, and Early 19th Century Social Movements, Craig returns to the concerns of his first book on popular radicalism. And in this book, he attacks the mythology that surround the narrative of, or some of the narratives of radical movements, that they emerged through some linear progression, that they're the most extreme end or point of a single dimension of progress. In other words, that they can be understood unidimensionally. Craig has conceived of these movements and thought of them as composed of multiple strands which do not sit easily or well with one another. He's argued that there are in fact different kinds of radicalisms, frequently in tension with one another, and they cannot easily and always be mapped along a single spectrum, even on left, right, and so on. It's a terrific account of our collective past that has the potential of telling us much about our present and our sometimes difficult and troublesome present. Craig is committed to the, and this is something which I read in I don't know, the small note which came to me from my office, but something, I'm paraphrasing it, he's committed to the highest standards of the production of knowledge, and this, I'm adding that, and he sets an example, this is something which I'm adding, sets an example by himself, meeting these very high standards, but he also believes that we must produce this knowledge in order to inform the public, not to keep it aloof from it, namely the public. With those words, I now ask my friend Craig to come and deliver this distinguished Golden Jubilee lecture.
Thank you.
I always worry about introductions that set up false expectations, and I think that some publicity agent of the LSE must have colluded with Rajeev on this. Capitalism seems unlikely to collapse next week. But it is also unlikely to last forever. It seems to be surviving the worst financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression in the world's historically rich countries, the West. But the crisis is deep and lingering. It comes on the heels of a damaging era of lopsided financialization and neoliberal weakening of social institutions. It accelerates a shift of economic momentum away from the long-standing core economies of Europe and North America towards newly developing regions. But as the recent difficulties of the Indian economy and the struggles in China to achieve a so-called soft landing suggest, this is not simply the rise of an Asian century and a smooth transfer of capitalist momentum from west to east. At the very least, capitalism is likely to be transformed. Indeed, arguably, the very momentum of the capitalist project may be renewed only if it is transformed. Capitalism in this sense is not simply a universal reflection of human propensity to truck and barter, nor of markets, nor even of investing wealth in enterprises to create more wealth. It is a historically created economic system, well established, but subject to historical changes. Capitalism, in a sense, I'm going to question this sense, so I'm not just endorsing it. Capitalism has been the dominant and driving form of economic organization for perhaps 450 years. Capitalism, though, has not been alone in this, but entwined throughout with both empire and nation state. Capitalism has brought enormously increased material production and closer global integration, but it has brought these with dramatic inequalities, with enormous conflict, and with massive environmental and other consequences. It has proved resilient in previous crises with help from governments, entrepreneurs, and others, and even capable of renewal after upheaval and transformation. But the first point I'd make, is that there is nothing internal to the financial crisis that has gripped the world for the last 5 years, nor to the more general contradictions and tensions of capitalism that spells its imminent end. The collapse of capitalism has long been foretold, but is as misleading in many ways as the uncritical celebration of capitalism. Indeed, both parts of anti-capitalist orthodoxy in the Marxist tradition and others, and much of the celebration of capitalism today share an illusion that there is, in a simple sense, a thing called capitalism. That is, that you can see a single, unitary, integrated system, give it a coherent analysis, and identify from its internal operating logic, the nature of its demise, or its potential triumph forever. To think well about how capitalism might be renewed, or about, indeed, thanks, Rajeev, the very possibility that capitalism won't succeed in renewal, is to think about historical transformation. It is, among other things, to demands embedding capitalism back in a sense of history, not imagining it as a system disembedded and abstracted from this process. It is to recognize succession of phases, changes, internal transformations, which mean that it is not exactly the same thing at all points in this history. And it is to recognize that this history unfolds alongside other histories in various parts of the world, and that this is not the same thing everywhere, even at the same time. It is part of the ideology of capitalism about itself that it exists in this systemic and disembedded sort of character. And it is an ideology about which we should be cautious. We need to think beyond the economy. The idea that capitalism is purely an economic system that can be understood within a set of relationships that are solely economic is part of the mystification of capitalism that we need to work beyond. The factors involved in understanding it are factors that connect it to a range of other things that are going on, and thus undermine even the very meaning of the sentence I'm speaking that refers to capitalism as it. Now, there's no substitute, and throughout this talk I will repeatedly speak of capitalism, but I want at the outset to begin to disaggregate and specify a bit more in this. I think only in this way will we manage to see more clearly what's going on and what can be the various possible futures. We need not simply a theory of capitalism, in other words, but an appreciation of how capitalism depends on relationships between economic and political organization, economic action, and the rest of social life. Capitalism has flourished on the basis of institutions and social relations that have been damaged in recent decades, institutions that it itself has sometimes helped to destroy. Its renewal will depend on their renewal or replacement. It is vulnerable, thus, not just to market upheavals, excessive risk-taking, or poorly managed banks. It is vulnerable to wars, environmental degradation, climate change, and crises of social solidarity and welfare. I want to explore these themes in 10 steps, tracing the challenges and vulnerabilities facing capitalism today. Inevitably, I will be more schematic than detailed, and I will not fill in the complicated histories that inform path-dependent futures, and which I think a really full understanding would require. So first step, disaggregating and specifying capitalism. We mean a number of different things by capitalism, and it's best to recognize these under their different names because they have different histories, different geographies, and different ways of connecting. So to exaggerate the totality of the package, I think, is to get off on the wrong foot. For example, markets are far wider than capitalism, exist in many settings other than those that we would rightly characterize as capitalist economies. And if we're speaking, as I am, about the future of capitalism or the end of capitalism, it is quite likely that markets, right, will characterize all possible futures, and there will be markets. They will not characterize all of any of those futures, so the idea of a completely market society is misleading. But markets are far wider than capitalism. Exploitation of labor, another candidate, equally, is a specific process. There is, I think, a shaky foundation in the labor theory of value for a strong claim that the essence of capitalism is the exploitation of labor and the creation of value through this exploitation. But the exploitation of labor is a dimension of capitalism, and as I will say in a little bit, a dimension that could change, possibly not be eliminated, but changed without being the end of capitalism, but also that could very well extend far beyond it. Again, it's not unique. Finance and financial capital comes closer to playing a unique and specifying role, but even it is a specific, not a general characteristic. Finance is a central and definitive form of capital, not just of money, and it's part of what makes capitalism capitalism to the extent that we want to accept that. That is, the portability of investment capital. Right? The thing that makes capitalism is in part that you can withdraw investments from one enterprise and put them in another, right, in a fluid fashion. A far more fluid fashion because money exists in many forms besides currency. It exists in debt instruments and in complex legal instruments that can be traded in markets, secondary, tertiary, and almost infinitely derivative markets. Right? And therefore, part of the crucial thing is that there is a separation between capital, in this sense of finance capital, and enterprises, specific businesses. And this is maintained by legal systems, by states, by structures of property relations. But it is also something that depends on states not being able to enforce an immediate control of capital such that the economic capital is always converted into political power rather than following return on investment. So finance is extremely important, but finance is variable in its relation to capital. Periods of capitalism may be more or less dominated by finance. We are living in an era at the tail end of some 35 or 40 years of ascendancy of finance. The period between World War II and the very early 1970s was not dominated by finance in the same sense. A simple illustration of this: in the United States, in the early 1950s, approximately 25% of wealth was held in the form of financial assets, and thus immediately fluid and portable assets. By the and this remained roughly the case until the early 1970s. The recession of 1974-75 can be taken as a marker of a transition, right? That culminated just before the 2008-2009 crisis, when 75% of all wealth was held in the form of financial assets. Right? So a virtual inversion of the proportionate financialization of the market. And this has a variety of impacts. It's influenced inequality. In epochs of financialization everywhere in the world, there has been a striking increase in inequality within economies. I'm not talking about inequality among nations here, but inside. There are other differences. Financialization makes it much easier to do what I said was intrinsic, in part to capitalism, to move investments from one enterprise to another. So it has resulted in things like the relatively rapid deindustrialization of many of the countries that became industrial in the 19th and early 20th century, in Europe and North America, with financial means playing a central role to that. It has driven a certain kind of globalization and enabled and facilitated it by capitalist markets. So financial capital is extremely important to capitalism, but variably important in different periods, and something to think about in this. And indeed, variably regulated, variably tied down. I'll come back to this. Capital accumulation itself may be the most important intrinsic feature to capitalism. That is the drive to accumulate, the organization of economic activity to the end of accumulating capital. And here, this is not, I would follow a broadly Marxist but also classical economic view. This idea of it being the driving force has to do with its intrinsic importance in competition. That, in effect, you can't stand still easily. That is, those who are accumulating have an edge over the others who are not. And so to try to stand still is to lose in economic competition. It's not only a driver, then, an organizer of competition, and, of course, an outcome, capital accumulation. But lest we think there is just capital accumulation, of course, the other side of it is recurrent destruction of capital. The Schumpeterian creative destruction in a positive view, destructions that are much less creative and positive, as, for example, there was a great deal of capital in India before capitalism and before empire that was destroyed. And there is capital that is destroyed in all economic transitions. So to speak of capital accumulation, speak of it a competition with winners and losers, and the overall result of concentration and accumulation of capital, but not a simple linear process. Now, in all of this specification of capitalism, and I could go on, and there are other features, but that's the center, in my view, one of the things I haven't said is intrinsic to capitalism is business. Business organization is certainly present, important, prominent. Business leaders are leaders of capitalism. But this, too, is something that far transcends capitalism in ways that I think are not insignificant. That is, we should not equate business as such with capitalism. And we need to recognize the potential for business to exist beyond it. Now, business can mean various things. I'm using it as a shorthand for enterprises. Enterprises that pursue various economic objectives, partly because I think there's very little chance that enterprises will disappear even with the massive crisis in capitalism, though many specific enterprises might. Now, enterprises come in various forms, and I will just stress a couple here to indicate a contrast and one of the illusions that is produced by much thinking about capitalism as a singular system. This is the difference between large and small, between corporations and entrepreneurs, and in a variety of other terminologies, right? Between a peculiar sort of large-scale enterprise in capitalism, which has a legal form, the corporation, that distances it from individual protagonists and allows it to exist for potentially a very long time. Now, this isn't to talk about corporations as such, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but one of the things that has been a feature of modern capitalism is the creation of new sorts of corporations. The corporation, as a legal form, was built on older models. Religious organizations, for example, that had corporate character in one way or another, that owned property collectively. They were an important influence. Even states were an example of a corporation. We'll come back to that. But the business corporation mattered because what it meant was that, unlike holding property in kinship relations or as individuals, the mortality of human individuals didn't necessitate any redistribution of the property. It meant, the corporate form, that it could be partially depersonalized. Now, I don't mean that Mukesh Ambani has no influence over Reliance as a corporation. I don't mean that individuals don't have power in this, but that the disconnection can be extremely influential. It enables very large-scale structures. These can intensify and sustain capital accumulation precisely because there isn't the same inbuilt mechanism for redistribution with mortality. But also, they organize life and opportunities for employees, and this is significant to think about because for a variety of people, the company they work for is as important as the country they live in or work in or are citizens. The delivery, in many places, of healthcare is more determined by whether you work for a large corporation with a benefits package or not than it is by what country you live in. Okay. A variety of other sorts of benefits follow this. Social networks and community are often organized in these terms for employees of these corporations. And having a certain status as a long-term employee of such a corporation or not is a basic differentiation of economic positions in modern life. These corporations are tendentiously described as private. Right? We say, oh, that's private property, private capital, though there are extremely large-scale social structures. The largest corporations control wealth in excess of 90% of the world's countries. Okay? To call them private is an ambiguous, at best, use of that term. Right? They are influential, but also disruptive, potentially, on large scales. Now, entrepreneurs are a different matter. Entrepreneurs can, of course, accumulate huge fortunes and create large companies, Steve Jobs and Apple, or any of a variety of Indian entrepreneurs as comparable examples. Right? But there are innumerable small-scale entrepreneurs. There is another face of business, including in capitalist societies, that is the launching of small enterprises. It is this that gives the notion of free enterprise to capital much more basically than large corporations. And we have to distinguish what we need from people launching small businesses of many, many kinds from the creation and the power of very large corporations. We mislead ourselves if we lump all of these together and say that because there is property ultimately held by individuals involved, and because capital, in some sense, is involved and required for each, that they are the same, the local tea shop and the massive corporation. Entrepreneurs are often innovators, but to associate entrepreneurship purely with innovation, to say that, oh no, the story of Silicon Valley is the story of entrepreneurship, rather than the story of tea shops, most of which are not innovations compared to other tea shops, they are additions, right, is to miss something of the point. And the extent to which an economy allows the creation of self-employment and the creation of small enterprises is a variable very different from the extent to which it is organized by large-scale financial capital or in large corporations. The entrepreneurs who are innovators, though, can be very important, partly because their innovations may be extremely disruptive and potentially bring challenges even to very large corporations, because large corporations that can wield enormous market power can also become sclerotic and conservative and fail to adapt in the midst of changes that come along. Large corporations and small businesses, both, could continue to pursue profit in a world in which private capital accumulation no longer is the central driver of global economic relations. So, to wind up this first point, if we break capitalism into a number of pieces, and I've only suggested a few of the conceptually different pieces, part of what we would see is that they might have different potential to survive beyond the package that has united them together for some period of time. That enterprises, small enterprises, entrepreneurship, but also some giant corporations could well continue. Giant corporations are political enterprises as much as economic. As Ronald Coase argued famously, they're held together internally by relations of power as much as by market transactions that work externally. Some of them could well survive in a radical transformation of the economy. We go to a second step. So the first step, right? Think of capitalism as not intrinsically a single tight-knit package. It's having these different dimensions. Second, especially when finance capital dominates, growth takes the form of bubbles punctuated by bursts. Now, this is an old proposition. Marx and his theory of crises and other crisis theories. I was just pointed yesterday to a recent film of Larry Summers, the former American Treasury Secretary and former Harvard president, giving a speech in which he channeled Marx practically. He said he had studied the recent history of capitalism, and he had seen that really the only form of growth was that of the bubble, that the bubble was capitalist growth. The bubbles cause damage, they're problems in various ways, but we should embrace them. Right? He channeled Karl Marx, but he decided to love the roller coaster of capitalism and to say it was a good thing. Right? To embrace the crises as merely the necessary consequences of the growth, and to regard the growth as intrinsically and unassailably good. Now, boom and bust cycles are pretty destructive. So this is significant. They're destructive in economic terms, but if it is the case, and there's a good argument to be made, that enormous amounts of growth come only in bubbles, that is, only in irrational exuberance, only in the chasing of opportunities by more than enough capital, and thus driving things beyond what prudent investment would, capitalism grows. If that's true, right, then we have to think about the consequences. One of them is that there's massive constant destruction that is part of this capital accumulation process. Destruction of human lives, because boom and bust, whatever they mean in aggregate statistics, mean that individuals are losing jobs or losing homes or losing their outright means of livelihood in all of this. So they're destructive at the personal level, but they're also destructive in environmental terms, they're destructive in other ways. But think about what this is. It's also a challenge. I'm not sure that Larry Summers meant all of this, speech in question on this. It's a challenge to notions like Homo economicus, the rational economic individual, because it suggests that capitalist growth, right, is not produced by rational investment. It is produced only by irrational investment. It is only the excessive investment of bubbles that drives fundamental economic transformations. Neo-Schumpeterian logics, thinking of technological change, suggest much the same. That it is the points in history, right, when money is drawn irrationally to investments, that there are many investments in things that are not predictable payoffs, some of which nonetheless, right, produce massive successes. It also means that systemic risk is endemic. That is, that the nature of capitalism, right, is to keep producing busts, and if it is interconnected, as it is by finance, then the systemic crises of finance are not accidental and not available to be eliminated. They are endemic. Recent capitalism, as I said at the outset, has been shaped by extreme financialization. Has very extreme dependence on finance, as was the case at the end of the 19th century, the era of high imperialism, as was the case in the 1920s. Right? It is a key feature of the era. This financialization produces boom, right, a kind of growth. The growth can take the place of new waves of technology, as it has in different periods, of impetus to globalization, as it has in different periods, of commodity booms. That is, one may forget that at the turn of the 20th century, Argentina was one of the 4 richest and most globalized economies in the world, although based entirely on extractive industry and agricultural produce, and therefore very vulnerable. And as we see now, chasing after commodity markets have the same character. The story of the last 40 years that I have to resist recounting, fascinates me, is this story of the financialization, how it was produced. And a very brief sort of hint at this is in order. Right? It signals, among other things, the connection of the events in politics and economics, and why I think capitalism is both a crucial concept and a problematic concept for this. Well, what happened that would produce a shift? We had a large era of industrial growth, industrial-led growth in Les Trente Glorieuses in France, in Europe, the post-war boom in the United States, in various other settings. It was a period of post-colonial hope and disappointment in much of the rest of the world, and this is a part of the story. But it's a period that comes to a crisis in the middle 1970s. And the crisis has several sources. And the crisis produces financialization. Let me just mention a few to signal the interdependence. One of them is the Vietnam War, the US engagement in Vietnam. But not because it's violent and not because the US loses, but because the war becomes so unpopular that the last 6 years of the war in the US are financed entirely on credit. Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, concludes that he cannot win support for tax increases to finance the war and must rely instead on credit. Massive increase in borrowing, the beginning of the large-scale deficit in the US, and the beginning of a problem that will lead on into the borrowing from the China that shapes the current US international posture. But at the same time, other things happen. The breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, with the US withdrawing unilaterally from an international currency stabilization pact and transforming the dollar into a fiat currency, a currency that is backed by the US government saying, I told you so, it's ours, rather than by gold. Right? And of course, this change happens in other currencies. It breaks down the system. It also has implications leading on in the present world. It reflects American hegemony in the world. After all, the dollar becomes the currency of record for counting all kinds of other things. The effort to create some kind of universal drawing rights system delinked from any specific currency fails, and the dollar remains crucial, which is extremely important, say, once again, in the US-China relationship today, where US and China are in many ways in structurally opposed positions, but highly interdependent and linked by the fact that China has so much of its wealth invested in US debt and dollar-denominated investments elsewhere. It can't really want the dollar to tank. However it might be tempting to see the US embarrassed. But there's more. There's the Yom Kippur War. Right? A major war in the Middle East in which which has a variety of effects on settlement patterns, the occupied areas, on refugees in Jordan, and all sorts of things, but among other things, on petroleum-producing countries, and leads to the transformation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, from a sleepy club for oil ministers into a cartel organization, and has the effect of dropping the price of oil per barrel in a fairly short period of time from about $3 to over $100 a barrel, transforming the economy and creating sovereign wealth funds. So the world's largest and richest sovereign wealth fund, that of the United Arab Emirates based in Abu Dhabi, is created in 1975 in the wake of the Yom Kippur War and the OPEC oil embargo. And massive amounts of finance capital then become available for investment elsewhere, for trade, lead to various things. Right? Now, I will resist temptation to go on in the story, but what the story is meant to illustrate is that the dynamics of capitalism are being produced by partially extra-economic factors, like wars and political responses, and that in crucial ways, these have economic effects. It's not that they're completely unconnected to the economy, it's that they're not contained within this separate idea of economic relationships as opposed to political or social or other kinds of things, and they produce a shift of finance. So the money, the finance, is the other side of credit, potentially, and investment, right? So it gets invested in various places. This capital is both loaned out and made part of equity investments, and it changes things all over the world. The crucial feature of this story, or one crucial feature of this story, is a shift in inequality that I alluded to. There is a dramatic increase in the Gini coefficient, that is the domestic inequality measurement, in every OECD country, although not equally in all of them. Right? In every OECD country, inequality went down between the end of World War II and the middle 1970s. In every country, it went up, and in some cases, quite dramatically. The US was the most unequal country at the beginning of this process, with a ratio of approximately 25-1 between the richest and the poorest. By the end of this period, it has a ratio of more than 700-1. Okay? That's a dramatic increase in inequality, okay, that accompanies this. And it has to do with the basic principle, which in a different context we could take back to John Locke and the principles that he draws out of the Bible to talk about the intrinsic importance of money, that is being able to accumulate without spoilage, among other things, and to overturn, right, the problems with dramatic accumulation, when dramatic accumulation couldn't take financial form. But it also has the importance of accelerating globalization and deindustrialization of the West. It's in this context, for example, that Daniel Bell writes a famous book on the future of post-industrial society, the coming of post-industrial society. And the phrase post-industrial spreads widely and is widely misinterpreted. But the argument is that there will come a knowledge society, a sort of benign future when we will no longer have pollution, we will no longer have worries about goods, we will all have jobs, but they will be in this new white-collar era with the end of ideology, the end of class, and a widespread transformation. Well, deindustrialization happens, but that post-industrial future doesn't come in the same form, and this remains an endemic problem in many countries of the world. Denser global interdependence widens exposure to all of this. That is, this then begins to reach in important ways into other parts of the world where there are new organizations of productive enterprise, new employment organizations. Widens exposure, but it doesn't reduce risk. That is, this is thought of through much of this period as an insurance system. Well, and in fact, the invention of the derivative, the famous derivatives that became part of the 2009 stock market crisis, is an attempt at an insurance system. That is, we will use these to spread risk so widely that, in fact, it reduces the risk individually, but it doesn't. Right? The risk remains extremely high, right? But the connections that can be drawn in are greater, so that we have the potential for downward accelerating spirals in varying depths, one of which we saw in 2009. These contain risks of systemic breakdown, but that fatality is not assured. Third, capitalism is always a political economy. I hope I don't have to argue this in detail, but I think it needs to be said because there is so much ideology arguing against it. That is the myth of free markets as a state of nature, rather than a politically created state, is just that, a myth. Any sort of market system with a relative freedom of actors has to be created. It doesn't exist as the state of nature. It's created by political power in large part. States provide necessary conditions, moreover, for capitalist transactions, including money, guarantees of transactions, of contracts, and limits on capitalism. They stabilize markets, including for labor. States also collude with some organizations of capital. For example, large corporations and the extremely rich. This can take the form of crony capitalism, to which India is no stranger, capitalism that is highly dependent on its relations with the state to be able to exist and to operate as capitalist enterprises. But it also is matters of policy more broadly, the extent to which business lobbies and large corporate lobbies inform policy in almost all the world's countries and many multilateral settings. Takes the form of things like patent protection crucial to intellectual property rights. Takes the form of massive investments for which no return is required. So, back to the entrepreneurs, there is a story about entrepreneurship. It goes back to the 1970s again. It tells you that a variety of people in Silicon Valley, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates among them, brought about a technological revolution. What the story doesn't usually mention is that all of the technologies that were crucial to this revolution were produced by government-funded research, which the government allowed to be commercialized for private property by these entrepreneurs. So the state matters in a lot of ways, and privatization itself may be one of these ways. Moreover, the very move to privatize associated with neoliberalism, whether in Chile or Great Britain or the United States, the privatizations of public property are state actions intended to produce more market transactions, more capitalism. Not least, states maintain the advantage of core countries, of rich countries, in relation to others, and at least sometimes this is successful for very long periods of time. States, moreover, in intermediate countries, Wallerstein would call the semi-periphery, promote the development, that is, state-led development. The ability to maintain a protectionist policy, or protect a domestic industry, is intrinsic to many developmental paths' success. So states play a significant role. Fourth, capitalism is an externalization regime. One of the things most basic to capitalism, not in my original list, is that capitalism works in part by maximizing profits through passing costs on to broader publics. Right? A large part of how capitalist enterprises work is by not having to pay all of the costs entailed in doing business. Education of workers to have skills to be employed, for example. Health costs that are part of the reproduction of the labor force so workers are healthy enough to come to work may be externalized. Sometimes corporations pay them. There are a variety of examples of this, right? But environmental damage may be one of the best ones to keep in mind. The extent to which the ability to maximize profit is immediately dependent, not in some long-term, distant, and contingent future, but immediately dependent on the ability to externalize costs. So that the very nature of the enterprise requires this. Fifth, capitalism both disrupts and depends on institutions. Community, family, and other traditional institutions are part of this story. Here, think of Karl Polanyi's story of the Great Transformation, and the way in which capitalism erodes, disrupts a variety of institutions, even while it depends on them. That is, capitalism depends on families to do labor reproduction, right, to stabilize the system, even while it in many ways erodes traditional family structures. It depends on traditional communities of various kinds, even while it undermines them, produces labor migration and urbanization and other changes that produce this. But it does undermine them. And institutions get formed. Polanyi speaks of a double movement, disembedding and embedding. That is, that capitalism pulls out of traditional communities, a variety of things, and then creates new kinds of institutional structures. Or rather, capitalism doesn't, but states do in response to capitalism, or other people do. So from state-led organizations that create new state institutions to deal in education, for example, or welfare institutions or others, through to NGOs and non-governmental organizations and various other ways, there's a double movement. Undermining one set of institutions that take care of people's lives and make them available to work, and replacing these by new institutions. But then the new institutions in turn can get undermined. recognize. Much of the neoliberal movement from the 1970s forward is the undermining and destruction of the institutions that were put in place generations earlier to deal with previous versions of this same problem in capitalism. So there is an issue here of disruption and yet dependence on institutions. Sixth, the state itself is the most important of these institutions that have both sustained capitalism and sustained ordinary life despite capitalism. So capitalism, my logic of externalization, creates a variety of demands, challenges, and costs, which are met by states, taking care of new educational requirements, the care of people in different settings after migrations, and so forth. So throughout the modern era, there has been state building. Polanyi's argument, in fact, was that state building preceded capitalism and made it possible. Right? And I think that's probably right, but it's not so much the argument I want to make as the simultaneity throughout capitalism of mutual interdependence, in which if states are not doing this, capitalism is in trouble. Not only people. So people are certainly in trouble, because if there is not state action in this system, people suffer. Right? But capitalism is at risk itself for this reason. The states are largely organized through the aspiration to a nation-state ideal. This notion is not quite accidental. The hyphen that sutures nation to state is crucial to the legitimacy of the state and the project of trying to care for the citizens, and much that is good comes with it. Democracy, for example, has been almost completely complicit with this nation-state construction throughout the modern era. So one of the reasons why throwing out the term nation, throwing out that project prematurely is dangerous, is that throwing out the units of organization of actually existing democracy is dangerous. Now, that doesn't mean everything works extremely well, but it does mean that legitimacy is anchored in the nation. And with the nation, there is a reference both to the people of a state and the people before the state. The idea there's some primacy to the people, the notion of legitimacy coming upward from the people, and to the sociocultural belonging that connects local life to large-scale world. So much of what we talk about as globalization, and we imagine a more cosmopolitan being in that globalization, comes with an illusion, I think. I won't elaborate the point, I've elsewhere called the class consciousness of frequent travelers. That is, the idea that there is an escape from culture, that belonging is something that is done by people in villages, by the backward. But those of us who go to universities and fly, preferably business class, and travel, escape from that. Escape from culture into a world of reason, right? But of course we escape into a different culture. We don't escape culture. We carry some things with us. We join in a culture, right? A culture of people who know how to carry on conversations about whether it's better to send your children to the LSE or the Kennedy School at Harvard. Right? A culture of people who follow global markets and are able to comment on that, who know that there's just been an election in Delhi or don't, right? That there are these conversations, right? That's also culture embeddedness. So nation and is not as foreign to this. It's part of the currency that connects local life to the larger world. The belonging, though, the sense of having it is important, right? Being a person without a nation, without a passport in the modern world, is a person, it's not the cosmopolitan, globalized, it's the person unable to participate in that cosmopolitan culture. Seventh, historical capitalism has been organized in a world system of nation-states. So not only have we, one by one, had this suturing of nation to state in this project with its virtues and limits of constructing nation-states, there is a world system. There's a debate that I don't really want to enter into, whether to analyze this global organization more in terms of labor processes and production of wealth, or more in terms of market processes and appropriation of wealth. Both clearly go on, and I don't particularly want to enter the famous Brenner-Wallerstein debate or others. But keys either way are that this world system, this organization of a sort of core of rich countries, I think the OECD countries, although that's breaking down in their power now, a middle ground or lower ground, simply organized inequality. You don't have to buy the Wallersteinian language for this or something. Organized inequality on a global scale disciplines competition, facilitates exchange and capital accumulation, that the world is organized. It's not a Hobbesian war of all against all any more than local life is. There are a variety of rules, there are multilateral organizations to enforce them. The largest number of non-governmental organizations in the world, the majority of all non-governmental organizations in the world, exist as business organizations to facilitate relationships among business. That is the largest number of NGOs that operate beyond borders in the world aren't Oxfam and Médecins Sans Frontières. They are organizations that do things like arbitration to make sure that contracts are carried out among corporations. So this is an organized world system. The global cosmopolitan world is very largely a world of treaties and agreements to which nation states remain central enforcers and central parties. The overall organization of this world system is always dependent on hegemony as well as cooperation. It's had power structure in it. It's depended on Dutch, then British, then American hegemony. There have been states able to enforce the rule. Eras of weakening hegemony are eras of instability, often marked by violent conflict. The world wars, for example, shape a period of declining British hegemony, are shaped by a period of declining British hegemony, right, with rivals for succession to the hegemony, and they produce, eventually, American hegemony succeeding to this. The rise of new or renewed powers in all of this can be organized in various different ways. Right? We are living through a period of declining hegemony. This declining U.S. hegemony, right, doesn't mean the U.S. is no longer an important country, or is no longer rich, or doesn't have the world's most powerful military machine. It means it's not rich and powerful enough to completely dominate and stabilize the system and dictate the rules. Okay? But it remains extremely powerful, certainly powerful enough to disrupt the system in a variety of ways, say by invading various countries. And this period when there are potential changes, right, is a volatile period. Right? So America, right, unable to stabilize everything, right, has a challenge. Right? Now, I think one of the issues is that America doesn't rise to this challenge very well. That there is no sign that the U.S. is going to go gracefully into a post-hegemonic era without continuing to try to run a world that it no longer can run. So independent of whether that's good or ethical or it should run the world, right? Leave aside that critique. It's going to try to do something it can't do and continue to try to run something it no longer can dominate in the same way. And there will be tensions over the costs of global power. There will be Americans who want to be isolationists at home at the cost. But there will also be the sheer fact of the military power of the United States, which exceeds its capacity to organize what has been called soft power in the world. But is there going to be a new hegemon? I think it's unlikely anytime soon. There is a school of thought that says China is just going to go from strength to strength in a continuous development and will relatively soon be the world's new global hegemon. I think that's unlikely. I think that first off, there are some considerable internal problems to be confronted on the way in China. But secondly, it's not likely to either invest that much in its global hegemony or be able to so outpace everyone else, including the United States, in a near-term future to do that. I won't explain all of this why, you can ask, but I think that's not the story. There are other possibilities. The US-China condominium, some sort of joint rule in which there are two countries that are at power. Broader multilateral great power cooperation seems more attractive, seems possible. I wouldn't bet large amounts of money on it personally. But there is a nice story that we can tell ourselves and we can hope for, in which the US and Europe and India and China and Brazil and Iran and Russia and some range of other significant countries in the world learn how to cooperate effectively to stabilize global order. And note the change. Note that Iran, which is clearly in this list, is one of the potentially very powerful countries in the world, right, is more and more looking like it could move into this position. Right? We could add Turkey, and we could add South Africa, we could make a larger list. The point is not the number. It's the larger the list, the harder it is to imagine the cooperation and everybody getting on the same page and making this work. Right? There's also the possibility of rival alliances, as occurred in the period of the two Great World Wars. And this seems equally likely, unfortunately, but much less attractive. Now, my point is not to try to make a prediction about this, so much as to indicate that the world system of nation-states depends on structuring order, and the capacity to do that organization is at risk. And finding some new way to do some stabilization organization is a big issue. That is not in and of itself capitalism. Capitalism is actually much more productive of growth and volatility and thus challenges that demand the stabilization than it is able to produce the stabilization. Eighth, we live in an era marked by overlapping transitions then. I just talked about one, the transition of declining US hegemony, but we could add technological transformation. This is not simply a story of the solution to all of our problems. This is a story of a very significant set of transformations. Transformation of communications by IT, but also issues, right? Challenges to the future of industrial employment, automation that limits the extent to which job creation follows from industrial production as it did in the past. Biotech, changing nature, including human nature, fertility manipulation, gender, the enhancement of bodies, sex selection of children, all of these sorts of things that are made technologically possible change the world challenge. Right? Now, what I would suggest is what they call for is that same institution-building response that Polanyi talked about in regard to 19th century capitalism. That is, all of these things create possibilities, possibilities that are attractive, but they also create enormous disruptions, enormous potential changes. You know, just play out the scenario of large-scale sex selection of children and ask how society changes if we get this sort of shifted ratio between boys and girls, and then think of the dozens of other things that can happen. Each of these also has economic bubbles and booms associated with it. As I mentioned, each of them has an interdependence between where the investment in the technology creation has taken place and where the profit goes. The continued great transformation continues with very different technologies. For Polanyi, it was the rise of market society with industry at the center, and that is no longer exactly what comes. But much of this great transformation continues. Urbanization would be one of the most powerful descriptions of large-scale social change in the world today. Massive urbanization and restructuring of whole societies, and India is a prime example of this. Urbanization is an economic phenomenon, but at once a political and social phenomenon. The amount of finance that goes into urban infrastructure, financing of urban infrastructure is a problem. The potential corruption on the one hand, job creation, right? Political capital, as well as economic capital, is a huge issue in all of this. But also, institution building and cultural change, learning to live in cities and figuring out what that life will be like is very basic. Intensified global interconnections that I've talked about don't mean the same thing as globalization happening everywhere. What they mean is that places that remain very different places are connected to each other. It doesn't mean that they become the same. And so we need to watch out for that illusion, the illusion of what we call McDonaldization, right? That globalization is simply the production of franchises of some single dominant capitalist model all over, which it isn't. In fact, it's completely compatible with re-regionalization. That question of Chinese global hegemony might be a Chinese project of regional hegemony, and indeed looks very much like that in many ways right now. And it may well be that regions are as important as ever in the world, that they are not being erased at all. Certainly Russia is defining lots of its political projects in terms of its domination of its near abroad, as it is called. And I think that we should be attentive to this. And we should notice, just as an allusion to the history, the extent to which these various regions reflect the footprints of old empires, and in which the stories of fault lines and clashes mirror those of old empires and civilizational structures. Now, in all this context, change is disruptive, but talk of collapse is misleading. At the very beginning, I said capitalism wasn't going to collapse this week, not even next year. But also, collapse is not the likely story. It's a very misleading story. You might talk of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union could collapse because it was an integrated legal structure. It was, in fact, a corporation, a state, and the state could be dissolved, right? Its underpinnings erased, right? Capitalism isn't that. There's nothing to dissolve and have before and after one day and then the next. Think of the comparisons. The Roman Empire. People speak of the collapse of the Roman Empire. It's a famous trope. It's a remarkable trope. It took 250 years, right? The collapse, right, was a long sequence of events, right, of back and forth, of re-strengthening and further losses of capacity to organize the Roman Empire. It was not any one of the factions of Rome. It was not any single moment. Or the collapse of feudal. Open question whether that changes the renewal of capitalism for another 50, another 100, another 500 years, or the transformation of capitalism beyond recognition, such that retrospectively we'd have to call the next era something else. So what shapes and threatens capitalism now, then? Well, I said systemic risk at the beginning, and systemic crises are important. Systemic crises come closest to the collapse model, the kind of systemic crisis that we saw 5 years ago and spreading throughout. Almost nothing has been done since 2008, 2009 to avert the repetition of this. All of the features that made that crisis possible are in place. And indeed, property bubbles are even coming back. And the same derivatives market, the same unregulated hedge funds, all of that. The result of systemic crises could be stagnation and slow growth, as we've seen in 5 years, can be the shifting balance of global economic momentum. Until 6 months ago, the Indian response to this account ought to have been, that's very nice, it's only a story about the West. Right? Don't worry, 7 or 8% economic growth. We're a bit worried about China, where the growth is 10 or 11%, but smiling faces all around, Indian capitalism, where do I sign up to be an entrepreneur? Now, that's still actually a motif in Indian culture, but people are a little more worried after the last few months. It isn't, in any case, a story of collapse. Institutional weakness, though, that is certainly a story on the agenda. And we should worry about institutional weakness. Even capitalist institutions struggle to adapt. The story of giant corporations isn't of invincibility as alone, it's also of vulnerability. These are institutions that are under huge pressure. That the doing things like getting rid of their pension plans and health care schemes in the US, right, have to do with a kind of intensity of competition that is belied by the very lavish lifestyles of their executives. Yes, people are getting rich, but the institutional form, the structure of the corporate institution, doesn't conform to their ideals easily. There's huge pressure. Institutions to meet demands from social change are largely absent. And think about it, in states and non-state organization, how much progress is there in state capacity to deliver services to meet new kinds of social demands in cities, in India and elsewhere? Service delivery, urban life, water, right? Water is a basic issue. It's an issue in the Delhi election that took place. Electricity, transport, all sorts of basic service issues are huge challenges. Education, healthcare, many of them are essentially being privatized around us and not shared. Care for the aged is increasingly an issue. One of the big issues that China will have to face, if it is to be anywhere near as continuously successful in the next period as it's been in the last, and there are others. Our era is one in which the overstressed institutional structures of the West, of the old core, are failing. They're being defunded by governments under budget pressure. Right? The LSE, a generation ago, was paid for by British taxpayers. Today, we receive 10% of our budget from that source. It's essentially private fees paid by students. Right? And this is going on everywhere in varying forms. Privatization, intentional privatization. The British examples are familiar ones internationally. Right? Privatization of British Rail a generation ago, the post office a month ago. Challenges of immigration should be understood in this light. Large-scale global immigration seeking jobs, which then becomes a political issue in all host countries, right, is a part of this story. And the ability to assimilate immigrants isn't infinite. In countries of rapid economic growth, the development of institutions lags economic and demographic change and the decline of older forms of institutional support. In other words, needs are rising faster than institutions to meet those needs almost everywhere. Migration's a bigger issue than just the reception of migrants in individual countries. It's a matter of complex global flows of rural, urban, interregional migration, but also of trafficking. But trafficking brings up illicit capitalism. Trafficking isn't just a bunch of isolated incidents focused on trafficking people, abuse of gender. It's tied up with trafficking guns, trafficking minerals, trafficking drugs, and it's part of a large-scale illicit capitalism that is integrated with capital accumulation. It also accumulates capital, as official capitalism does, but it doesn't support states. It doesn't pay taxes, right? It is a drain on the capacity to meet the institutional challenges of capitalism that the accumulation takes place in illicit forms. Businesses backed by coercive power are part of this. But state capitalism is another option in this, the extent to which the Chinese story is not a free enterprise story. It is in part a story of a very close state involvement in economic development, and Korea and other cases of this. It's not at all clear that continued capitalist growth will be in a model that favors liberalism and capitalist democracy. One of the stories told for the last 150 years has been that capitalism leads almost automatically to liberal democracy. But that seems something that is dubious as a general proposition today. We move on. I've mentioned environmental degradation a couple of times. Near the end, let me stress it. This is a strong example of the issues at hand. First, just seeing the natural environment as resources is a transformation in a view of the natural environment. It is a set of resources to be used and potentially used up. So we have depletion and exhaustion questions, and potentials for conflict and resource conflicts. Energy is perhaps the central example, but major issues there. But natural environment is the context of our lives, as our world, pollution and waste and the destruction of that. Think of the pollution of Beijing as a problem to be solved by China on the way to continued global economic growth. That externalization of the benefits of capitalism isn't very far outside, and you breathe it inside every time you move. Climate change in general is potentially directly life-threatening. Cleanups are extraordinarily costly. But there may be something equally big. Capitalism is threatened by environmental decline, and in fact, if this were the kind of thing you could bet on, I would bet that capitalism will survive long enough to be destroyed by environmental disaster. I, in a recent chapter in a book, wrote this and was described by somebody who reviewed the book as, some authors are optimistic, like Calhoun, who thinks environmental disaster will become before the crisis of capitalism. But I think equally likely is war, and that we really have to take seriously, at the extreme, the potential of large wars. Not world wars in exactly the form of the old ones, not European-centered, there are other things. But it's worth remembering these crises. And greatly increased risks if we have these large-scale wars because of advanced weapons. But continuous lower-level conflicts should remind us that the notion, the Steven Pinker notion, that we just automatically become less violent with evolution, is a dubious proposition in our world. Yes, there are fewer wars, and the current death rate isn't as enormous as it's been sometimes. But think of the risks of escalation. Think of the risks of outside powers being drawn in Syria that have been an issue. I'm actually rather happy the outside powers, including the US, have managed not to be. But think of the games being played between China and its neighbors over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, and the American Five Eyes and all of this, and the chances of these things going wrong. There is a draw for the US in that it can still symbolically assert hegemony, but it's hegemony it doesn't have. And there's a desire on the part of a variety of neighbors of China to have that US assertion, but there's a risk in all of this. 10 and last, these challenges can be approached in different ways. And the different ways can involve relying more or less on capitalist solutions. It's not just a question of whether capitalism can survive or whether we want it to. It's a question of how we deal with various problems. Take the problem of old age. There are for-profit capitalist solutions to this. They are much less equal than others, but they do provide ways with insurance policies, with for-profit nursing homes, and with other resources to try to care for the old. Right? There will be a competition among different sorts of solutions. There will be opportunities for entrepreneurs. Giant corporations will be important as internal communities. State capitalism may matter, but the issues will all exceed capitalism. Right? Corporate participation in global governance still doesn't replace states. Right? And as an externalization regime and a growth machine, capitalism is unable to deal with all environmental questions. Finally, pulling illicit capitalism into legal frameworks is a deep challenge. Right? Illicit capitalism has had a faster growth rate than China over the last quarter century. Part of our predicament is that established states have weakened capacity at a time when we still need states. Right? The conditions around us have undermined the established states. They don't work as we'd like them to work, but that doesn't mean we don't need what they were in part intended to offer. Even capitalism needs states, despite decades of anti-state rhetoric. And it's very unclear what the effective alternative to states might be. But that's another story. My suggestion here is that capitalism will not collapse, but that this doesn't mean that the challenges and changes we face are any less fundamental. It means that figuring out the place and the potential of capitalist, indeed business, activity in the future is crucial. Capitalism, unlimited and unbridled, is a problem, but wishing it away could mean failing to address how to make it work better. Capitalism can only be part of social life and social change, not all of it. We need to put some focus on building institutions that are able to restore some balance in our lives and some care for those who are the victims of the massive inequalities and degradations of capitalism. Thank you.